to another edition of the Energy Podcast. Right away, alongside Globetrotter, energy guru, Dr. Energy herself, ellen-wald. Ellen, how's it going?
Everything is, I think I said earlier, things literally blew up over the weekend, but everything is great here. I'm in the wonderful city of New York, of Manhattan. So we're doing great.
Yeah, and we have Dr. Dean-Foreman coming on, and I'm sure he will break down some of the impacts of this weekend on their report. It'll be interesting to see. I put out a thing on LinkedIn this morning, Ellen. We've talked about this before, that there's really been nothing that has made the oil prices really respond in any manner. This was the first thing. As we're recording this, WTI is at up $7.93, up 62.78, and Brent's almost at 70, 69.19, 8.97.
That's higher.
You sent me a note.
Last time I checked, it was 68.
Right. You sent me a note this weekend asking about the gift card. I think it was WTI had hit 70. We'll have Nate pull the tape and confirm that for next week. I think it was WTI has hit 70. Now 62. Listen, it's up $8 almost. We'll say that's a change, and it's a sudden change. But it's not like it cracked 75 overnight, or or going to 80 or anything like that. So there does need to be some perspective. My question for you is, just before we kind of get the rest of the show, we had tankers that were seized. We had drones possibly being bombs being dropped. None of that really made the price do this. But if we were to see something like that again in the next week or two, do you think now we are in kind of that water where we could see the price really uptick on a tanker getting seized or a drone strike or somewhere?
So that's an interesting question. So first, we actually did see a tanker getting seized earlier today. So Iran seized a UAE fuel tanker. It was not carrying very much, and it was not carrying crude oil. And there's no real telling if that actually affected the prices, since they're kind of going all over the place anyway. But it could have. I think that the prospect of oil prices being much more reactive to events in the Middle East, in particular the Gulf, is definitely heightened. But I think it has to do with a couple of things. The first is the fact that currently there's 5.7 million barrels of output offline. And so that's actually a significant amount of oil. It's funny because I was thinking about the Druzhba pipeline. That was 1% of the global market. This is closer to 6%. So now we know what it takes to hike oil prices. You need to combine Saudi Arabia. Here's your formula. Saudi Arabia plus, I wish I had a whiteboard. I really want to whiteboard right on these white walls behind me, but then that would be really weird. So Saudi Arabia plus drones / cruise missiles. We're not sure yet. I'm hesitant to listen to, the Twitter experts. It turns out that there are a lot of people on Twitter who are experts in drones and cruise missiles. I had no idea there were so many self-proclaimed experts on this on Twitter. Anyway, we don't really know yet. But so you add that plus Saudi Arabia plus oil outage, and then I told Iran plus Iran, and you gotta add Trump tweets. There's some sort of magnifier or coefficient there. And
diagrams and stuff.
Locked and loaded. That's definitely a phrase that will help push oil prices up. Though I'd like to, if we can we'll talk about that later. So I think you've got this formula. So I think that if we do see anything, we've got this heightened tension, plus we've already got barrels off the market, and that could definitely make things much more reactive to situations in the Gulf.
Well, I'm glad you told me that. I've been recording other shows this morning, so I did not know the tanker deal happened. So that's interesting to see. That's the problem when you record 4 podcasts in one day. You really just kind of just pop in, and so that's good. It's interesting to know what would happen there. I do know Bolton stepped down. What was that?
Stepped down, removed, resigned, fired.
Right, whatever. He's gone.
last
week, right? Well, and was it him? Was he the one that was saying, or was it Pompeo that was saying that if you do this to our friends of friends, cousins, second cousins watch removed? Was that him or Pompeo that was saying that if you do that to Iran, they will strike back at you? I can't remember. But regardless, that's what the Trump administration said, whether it was him or the other guy. And so Trump saying locked and loaded. And look, I'm not being disparaging. I'm just simply commenting that I don't know. I'm not saying Trump should respond or shouldn't respond. I'm just saying as a simple historical, looking at what Trump's done through historical actions, I wouldn't expect him to do anything that actually would be my take on it.
Yeah. So yeah, and I'm going to give an analysis, and I'm going to say that this is not technically my analysis. I heard this from someone who actually apparently used to work for the Trump administration, the State Department or something, or was part of the administration at some point. Who now works for Atlantic Council. I was on the Atlantic Council press call earlier today, and she really put into words this perspective, which is what I was thinking, but she said it better than I could say. So I'm just going to kind of convey her analysis. So she said, Trump likes to use hyperbole. So locked and loaded is one of those hyperbolic phrases that kind of gets people going, and that this is something that he does, and there's a purpose to it. In addition, there's a purpose to he's basically saying to Iran, we are ready and we have the capability to take you out. And then he said, we know it was Iran. We're waiting for the Saudis to confirm. And so he basically threw the ball into the Saudis' court. And the question is, do the Saudis, what do they want to do with this? Do they want to start a war with Iran? Do they want to go and say, yeah, he's basically giving the Saudis an out, because the Saudis don't want to go to war. This doesn't mean we're going to go to war, but he's not saying we are definitely committed to it, but he's standing up. He's like the bully in the he's standing up and he's like beating his chest and he's showing everyone the might of the United States is like focused on you. Now, what do you guys want to do, Saudis? They can choose negotiation. MBS can decide, I don't know, we're not sure we believe that Iran did it. He can choose to go that route. And it's interesting that he's putting the ball in MBS's court, because a war with Iran for MBS would be devastating.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I agree the locked and loaded is hyperbole. I guess, one of the things, and we've talked about this for years now, it's hard to believe that Trump's been president for years, but he has been. It feels like, on some days it feels like he's been president for my entire life, and other days it's like, wait, he's still, that started already? But regardless, if you remember back to Dr. Fedewa or Dave Blackman, any of those guys, they all say, hey, he uses this language to negotiate in, which is what you're saying, not the hyperbole. I just think in this case, let's say that Iran is the ones behind it. At some point when you're going to physically fight someone, whether it be with a gun or your fist, at some point you do call someone's bluff. And there has to be an action. So, he did pawn it off to the Saudis. And he is using hyperbole, but my only thing is that you remember that line from Jurassic Park, the first Jurassic Park, where they go, the raptors test the fence every day, and they never test the same spot, the same, it's like Iran's doing that. They're just keep testing it, and if you're not going to do anything, we're just going to eventually find the weakness, and what are you going to do?
So Iran are the raptors. I like this.
Yes.
I like that analogy. Iran is like the raptor. I'm putting that in the show notes for everyone. Iran is like the raptor, not the Canadian Toronto Raptors.
No, and actually, if you think about it, it makes sense now, because the old guy in the movie was like, we didn't spare a dime on nothing but the best. He actually kind of taught like Trump, so maybe the analogy is fitting. That's it. Well, I did see you retweeted, I think, or liked a tweet yesterday that said that 40% of the capacity should be getting underway or back underway. Is that true? Can we confirm that? Was that early report that was off? What do we know about that?
I think we're probably more likely to see 2/3 or not 2/3, sorry, 1/3 than 40%. You probably would be able to. You'd probably know more about this than I do, but I feel like I've had a crash course in oil gas separation plants. So apparently, at least according to what I learned on this press call, was that I was actually speaking on the call, but not about these things. So I learned a lot from my fellow colleagues at Atlantic Council. So apparently Abcake has 18 gas oil separation plants, and they stabilize the oil and they remove certain, parts of it to make it ready to ship in the particular grades that Aramco wants to ship. So they do a lot of removing sulfur, I guess. 5 out of 18 of the stabilization towers and some spheroid tanks that held crude are damaged. It's not clear how badly some of them are damaged. There are other of these oil gas separation plants and stabilization things in other parts of Abcake that were undamaged. The whole plant was shut down because they had to evacuate, and they had to evacuate all the personnel. So they shut down everything. So that's why 5.7 million barrels of oil is taken offline. Parts that are undamaged are expected to come back online. It's the parts that are damaged that will take longer. And so I guess the question is, how much of the plant is safe to run while they're doing repairs to the rest? So, it could be a third, it could be a fourth, it could be 40%,
Right.
We're going to have to see. I think they're supposed to make a full damage report tomorrow. But so it seems like that's really it. It's not like everything is damaged, but some things are. The parts that are undamaged will be brought back online.
Yeah. One thing I've often wondered is you look at like a tack on this, it would seem that there's more strategic things you could do that would have longer impacts than these attacks. But there's probably more optics in kind of, being able to do this. I am curious, what are your thoughts on the IEA? I'm just curious because every time, I saw them and they were tweeting or something over the weekend, like we're talking to people in the Saudi Arabia administration, and Are they really getting those people on the horn, like people that matter when there's bombs going off in the nation, or is it like some low level staff are like, go talk to these guys?
Yes.
What is going on?
I messaged with someone in Saudi Arabia, so clearly I am receiving all of the latest updates from the royal court himself.
There it is.
It's out. Actually, so it's interesting. I mean, the guy who runs it seems to hobnob with all the bigwigs. The IEA is interesting. They're supposed to be more than just a oil demand forecast depressor. Mm-hmm. Basically, not that they cause any depression, but they make us depressed about it,
right?
By issuing lower and lower demand forecasts every month or however often they issue their reports. My guess is that their interest in knowing what's going on is because they can issue. They're comprised of countries that maintain a particular amount of oil in storage, and so they can then say hey, Spain, get ready to release your SPR or something like that. Right. Or you might want to think about this.
Right.
My sense is that the guy who runs it, Fatih Birol, seems to hobnob with the big guys, but who knows if they're really the first people that this. They're
getting on WhatsApp we got to tell the IEA what's going on here.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's the case. Well, let's see here. One other thing I was going to ask you about this relation to this. When you see we'll call it a crisis for lack of a better term, you see an event like this, people begin to analyze data differently. We have had some decent draws in the storage report that come out on Tuesday night and Wednesday mornings over the past few weeks. Do you think if we have a large draw, 5 million, 6 million this Wednesday, that the markets might have a slight overreaction because the Aramco issue won't be resolved fully by Wednesday? There'll be more information, but still, it won't be there. You have reports of, obviously, U.S. oil production is eventually going to slow down because we're pulling rigs off. Do you think that something like Wednesday might get an overreaction for the market just because we have seen a lot of draws lately, and we're at a time where people might be looking at news a little differently? Yeah,
I actually wonder if some people are now really oversensitized. It feels like everyone's in two camps. There's the people who are getting on they're starting to beat the drums for war, all the neocons in DC who are super, super excited to make the U.S. go to war with Iran. So forget about oil, forget about anything. They want to go to war. And that's all they're talking about is missiles and Iran and whatever. Yeah. Everybody else who's interested in this is focusing on the oil part, which is how much oil is out? What's the market going to do? Right. Everything gets amplified in the market these days. So I'm really not surprised to see the market, like everyone being focused on this, whereas people might not have been focused on like, what's the draw? If there's a draw, it's going to freak people out, and everything's going to be amplified because there's so many more people interested in trading oil.
Right. It is weird. There is a segment of the U.S. society that's like, hey, wait, we can go to war? Hold on. It's Iran? Oh, okay. Well, yeah, we're in. It is kind of creepy that we do have those people, the neocons especially, that are a little bit too excited for my comfort. But we are right-wing propaganda, so we love those people dearly and sincerely on this show. Okay, last piece before we get on Dr. Foreman. From the Wall Street Journal. It says a Saudi oil attack is the big one. The technological sophistication and audacity of Saturday's attack will linger over the energy market. There was a time where I talked a little bit about cybersecurity and stuff like that, but obviously, this is a little bit different. What do you take this to mean? Ellen, do you think that we should look at this as a shift in power dynamics, or what's the takeaway here, in your opinion?
I mean, I was, frankly, this piece, like, I almost wanted to, like, rip apart my Wall Street Journal, except that I was reading this online, so I couldn't physically rip it apart. Basically, it was like, this is the big thing. This is going to redefine the global economies everywhere. Give me a break. This is not going to redefine global economies. In fact, and I wrote this in a piece of Bloomberg, which will hopefully be coming out, although I think that this section may have been removed, so I'll give this to all of our listeners. There are events that change the global economy, like 9/11. 9/11, all air travel was suspended in the United States. Markets were closed for days. Like people, I mean, that was a massive economic changing event. Here, no people were killed. Production went offline for 2-3 days. Some of it's coming back, and I did see that 40%. Energy Intelligence reported that 40%, which could come back online soon. So, this is not a global economic changing event. I mean, maybe if you were not paying attention to anything since the Gulf War in oil, then maybe you'd think it was But I just don't. I think that's being way overplayed.
Okay, so let me ask you
think about this. Brent was $86.29 on October 3rd last year.
Right.
What's Brent now? Is it even 70?
It wasn't 70 when we started. No, it's at 68.95. So no. So let me ask you like this. Let's rephrase this in this manner. And you are the Middle Eastern foreign policy, whatever you want to call it, expert here. So if we look at it from this perspective, we have the Saudis and Yemen who have been at war for however long it is now. We have the Iranian stuff. And as you said on the show before, they can play well when it comes to oil, but other stuff they're not really buddies on. Could we see, and I hate to say could we see because you can see anything, but is it closer now maybe than it has been in the past where some of the dynamics are changing because there could be something like, well, the Saudis do decide to go to war or push the U.S. to war with Iran. And we look at this as maybe the straw that broke the camel's back 6 months from now. Obviously, there's been other things that's happened over the past, year and years in this area. But could this be kind of the turning point to where it's not as cataclysmic as 9/11, where you can look at that and hey, that's when that's where they changed. But could it escalate things to where we look back 6-8 months, a year from now, we go, you know what, that was actually in hindsight, it didn't look like it was major then, but it actually did change some of the global landscape.
So that's really interesting. Because it's true that we could totally look back on this event and be like, this was the thing that started it all. And that's something we won't know until possibly even years later. I mean, not to put in not to hawk my former profession as a historian, but that's what historians help identify. They help identify what was the event that really changed it, because we tend to not realize it when we're living it. But here, you said it first.
I'm on the record. So, I got it. I planted my flag. And I'm not saying that because I hate to be the guy who says, hey, in 2035, we're going to look back at this. I'm not saying that. It's just, you've studied the Middle Eastern stuff. Is this kind of, in the norm for the Saudis in Yemen, and assuming Iran takes responsibility at some point, or it is proven to be Iran? Is this kind of the tension? Because it doesn't feel like, at least the past decade, this is where the tension's been. It's been, from the American side, it's Syria, it's Iraq, it's Afghanistan. We talk about all that stuff. So the Saudi side of things, is this kind of normally where they're playing at, or is this new for them?
I think it's not, but I think that the center of, like, I don't want to say the center of power, but really like the locus of issues in the Middle East changes. So like in the 60s, it was Egypt was really the locus of all stuff. Like that's where it was happening. They were the ones who were setting the schedule and kind of defining the parameters of the conflict. And then it kind of moved maybe a little bit to Israel, like in the 70s, a bit more. Egypt kind of became more weak, and Israel was really kind of on the rise there, and maybe even Israel and Syria for some time, or Lebanon and Syria in the 80s. And now we've definitely shifted over more towards the Gulf. I mean, Iraq was really a center in the 90s and Saddam Hussein was deliberately trying to promote himself as a leader of the Arab world. So that makes sense. But yeah, it's interesting because it does seem like the center is steadily moving east.
Right.
And now we're in Saudi Arabia and Iran. So I wonder where we'll go next. Well, leaders rise and fall.
Yeah, that's true. We don't know. It is, fun to talk about, and in this case, it's good to talk about because no one was actually hurt that I'm aware of. So it's at least you're talking about a story where there's no human loss of life, which is at least a positive takeaway, because sometimes those stories are not that. It's I am on the homepage trying to catch up on the news of Drudge Report, trying to see what all. And I love, sometimes Drudge has got some good stuff, sometimes he got some terrible stuff. But I will give it to him. He has a way of titling stuff that is pretty funny sometimes.
So it's kind of funny. So, like, my mother once said to me that she really, really wants to hear me on this NPR program called Fresh Air. That's would be so according to her, if I'm ever on that program, I will have
arrived.
I've arrived. So but if I ever get an article on Drudge, then I'll think I've made it. That would be it for me.
If you get an article on Drudge, you better change your bio to say friends with Ryan Ray or something. I want some of that SEO traffic you're going to get, because
I'm at least hoping that it'll be an article that I write that gives me some sort of remuneration for clicks, because otherwise it's totally lost.
What would be hilarious is if you made the top part of Drudge and you still didn't get the editor's choice for Forbes.
Oh, I know.
That would be just.
I think I would.
That would be hilarious.
I think you're missing something.
You're missing something here. Well, any other final quick comments before we get on Dr. Foreman? He'll be hopping on here in just a second to go over there. I think they got a quarterly report.
Well, Twitter has been an interesting place these days, like I said. But one of the interesting things that I did see on Twitter that I thought was useful, that I wanted to maybe call to attention, is a lot of people have been saying, look, Saudi Arabia buys so many weapons from the U.S. Why were they not able to prevent this attack or shoot this down? And there's a woman named Becca Wasser who works in Saudi, she works on Saudi military stuff for RAND Corporation. And she explained this. I thought it was very, very interesting explanation, which is that she says that the defense of oil infrastructure falls under the Ministry of Interior, not the Saudi military. And they're two different areas, bureaucratically. And so most of the U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia, especially air defense, go to military, not the Ministry of Interior. And they're much more geared to focus on domestic threats. So domestic terrorism, as opposed to a threat attacking oil infrastructure from outside. So, I thought that was, that was a really interesting thing. And I wonder if this may cause the Ministry of the Interior to seek out more missile defense systems from the United States. So this is a question that I've seen a lot. And maybe...
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying maybe listeners had that question.
Yep. I do have something I want to put in your wheelhouse. You are the genius on the show. The Houston Chronicle read something from PolitiFact, Texas. And it says,
PolitiFact. I was once quoted on PolitiFact.
Oh, well, I hope they
something
quoted
about universities.
Okay.
Bizarre.
Here's what the headline reads. Rick Perry says the U.S. leads on producing energy and reducing emissions. Is he right? Okay. Here's the quote. The U.S. now leads the world in producing both oil and natural gas and at the same time reducing energy-related emissions. So we lead in natural gas and oil and reducing energy-related emissions.
I would say, to me, that means that when we produce energy, we don't make a lot of emissions doing it. What do we think that means?
Maybe. Here's how they handled it. PolitiFact ruling is half true. They said, quote, it's true that the U.S. is the leading producer of both oil and natural gas as of 2018. Okay, so they're not arguing that. But the second part of Perry's claim needs more context. We need to step back and look at shifts over the past 5, 10, and 15 years. The U.S. has reduced total carbon dioxide emissions more than any other nation. But dozens of other nations made larger reductions in percentage terms, and from 2017 to 2018, carbon dioxide emissions in the U.S. increased. Now, when you hear that, this is what drives me crazy. You're not telling me anything, Ellen. If you have 5 cans of Coke and you lose 3 cans of Coke, okay, you have lost a substantial percentage of your cans of Coke. If I have 1,000,000 cans of Coke, but I got rid of 75,000 cans of Coke. I have done more to get rid of the cans of Coke than you have, but percentage, and I'm just doing the math off my head, but percentagely, I haven't come near the way that you have. So I just see these stories, and I don't understand why they can't. Is that hard? I mean, I'm not even college educated like a lot of you folks are. That seems to be pretty simple. When you're saying that this is a truth or a half truth, shouldn't you actually tease out what the percentages are and what the actual numbers are?
Yeah, and that PolitiFact, that's like what they do. I'm trying to remember exactly what they asked me, but they asked me something, and I think it had to do with universities. Mm-hmm. And I was like explaining it to them, and they like didn't print like part of the important nuance, and I was just like, ugh.
And so they do go on and kind of tease it out a little bit better through the article, but you have to know, as you write a lot of articles, the topper on the closer to the top on the page or the last paragraph is probably what's going to get read. You know, either you get someone's attention or you they'll read to the summary, and so they the rulings in half. So at this point, I don't know what is true or not because they didn't give enough information. Up next, making his monthly appearance on the Energy Week podcast is Dr. Dean Foreman, who is the chief economist at the American Petroleum Institute. You can find out more at api.org. Going to the top right of the page and clicking on chief economist. They have 2 reports coming out this Thursday. We're recording this Monday. Dr. Foreman, I'm just curious. We were talking about some of the news that broke this weekend. Will this impact, what you guys are going to release on Thursday? And have you been kind of working behind the scenes to update any of this information, or is it kind of we kind of had to go with it at this point because it's too late to change stuff?
Well, hi Ryan, hi Ellen. You're right. We have had to add some things to make it just up to date, but it's not. It's minor surgery, if you will, in that we're adding some content that really addresses some of the current balance issues.
One of the things, and this might not be relevant at all, I'm just curious, is that we also saw, apart from the news with Saudi Arabia, we also saw, and unless I haven't checked the news this morning, but I believe GM is on strike. Do we look at that as any indicator or anything that, obviously might not play in this report, but future reports? Is there something to track from a listener standpoint? I just want to get your quick comment on that before we dove into the report.
Well, to be honest, I haven't really looked at the GM news.
Okay.
The market news this weekend is potentially consequential, and the market's still digesting it. We need to see how much and for how long. But directionally, though we can't predict the price, we can see exactly how it tends to play out historically when we go through situations like this.
Okay, so you have 2 reports, as I mentioned, your monthly report and your quarterly report. Let's start with the quarterly. I like to kind of paint these narratives as we go through months and years. What are you have your key takeaways here on your Q3. Is there anything that surprised you, anything that caught you off guard, or did the narrative kind of fit where you thought it would land at the end of for quarter 3?
So we've got some discrete modules, and for the first time, we've got different blog posts that we put on our API Energy Tomorrow blog, and those, as you mentioned, from the chief economist side, are also available that give more explanation. But the high-level thing, especially with the UN General Assembly happening next week, we've got a lot of climate-sensitive things this month. So the progress the United States has made in terms of liquefied natural gas or LNG exports, that is directly supplanting the burning of coal among emerging markets globally. So there's a really good environmental story that goes with bringing emissions down around the world by virtue of the American progress there. But the other side of it, and hitting with recent events in Saudi Arabia this weekend, our upstream sector is just hitting on all cylinders. And this also is reflected in our monthly statistical report coming up, but record crude oil production, record natural gas liquids production. So 12.3 million barrels per day of crude oil. With that happening, we're seeing basically a resurgence continuing in the refining sector. So despite fewer refineries over time, we saw this last month where the refinery capacity utilization spiked above 95%. So it's the highest so far this year. That's on target with the best of last year. We're importing less crude, using more of the domestic light oil that's being produced, and we're exporting more. And we've talked in this program about in recent months about how China had stopped purchasing and what games that might play. But with the outage in Saudi Arabia, China may not be able to be so picky about where it takes its supply from. So the U.S. continuing to grow as a preferred provider of crude oil and refined products to the world is a continued theme here. We've addressed IMO 2020, the International Maritime Organization's tightening fuel specifications and what that might do to the market. We have highlighted that EIA is still saying that we're on target in the fourth quarter this year for the United States to become a net energy exporter on a total energy basis for the very first time before the end of this year. We'll see if that holds, but it looks great if we're continuing to grow as we are. And then the things that are somewhat surprising, Ryan, there are two. One is that we looked at a state-by-state analysis of for those states that tended to use more natural gas instead of wind or solar, vis-a-vis in their actual net generation, not capacity adds, but what they actually got out of generation, did they get higher or lower electricity prices? And what we found was that 78% of the time, the states that tended to use more natural gas saw lower prices over 8 years, and the ones that used relatively more wind and solar saw higher prices. So that was tying together a bunch of state-specific analyses that we've done. And then the very last point is we've got an unprecedented queue of LNG projects that have now been commissioned or green-lighted to be built, both regulatory approvals as well as companies taking the final investment decision affirmatively to contract and build these things. And this is an unprecedented amount of new multi-billion-dollar project development for the United States. That simultaneous regionally concentrated development across the U.S. Gulf Coast poses unique challenges in terms of workforce development and all of the craft labor categories that are going to be needed to execute those projects. And there's a backstory about the dynamics of how the first wave of those projects has played out vis-a-vis the second wave and some of the cost containment measures that creatively will have to be deployed in order to make sure that those projects can, in fact, be executed. So those are the highlights.
So maybe we could just delve into one or two of those before we get into the other report. So one of the interesting things that you mentioned is that we've got fewer refineries than we've had before, though some of those are very large refineries and been expanded, but refining capacity utilization is very, very high. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the impact of the closure of the Philadelphia refinery and what that has had on the refining situation. And I don't just ask this because I think it's important, but also because I'm from Philadelphia. And so I'd like to hear a bit more, delve into that particular refining element.
Well, I'm with you because I'm originally from Pittsburgh, so I get it. Now, Philadelphia Energy Solutions, it had a fire and the refinery was shut down in June. And this is a 300,000 barrel per day refinery that it provided gasoline and jet fuel and distillates throughout the region. And then the question is, did it have a market impact? And we actually do have a slide that's an event study of what this outage of that refinery has done. And, looking at state by state, what we did is a year-to-year comparison of what happened to the state's difference in gasoline and diesel prices relative to the national average, so that we're effectively controlling for both seasonal differences and differences in crude oil prices along the way. And what we saw is that the gasoline prices were a wash. They were basically, in 3 of the 4 states we looked at in the region, they were down and not up. So there was no real change there. On the distillate or diesel fuel side, the prices in all states were slightly higher, but not markedly higher. And it made sense because this refinery did place a fair amount of diesel within the region. But what it did is it validates this overall production growth, supply growth side for U.S. refining, where because we are such a strong export platform for refined products now, it says we're a market that's long product, and we had the ability between the Colonial Pipeline bringing that in, potential for imports, that the market's fluid and it's working. And despite the outage of a 300,000 barrel per day refinery, the market was able to fill the gap effectively.
And that's really interesting. One other thing I was hoping you could elaborate on is the net energy exporter stat, because we see this thrown around a lot. In fact, our president mentioned this. Maybe we could just break that down and explain what that really means and why it's significant, or maybe perhaps what isn't significant and what people shouldn't read into it.
Well, the administration has historically attached the term energy independence or energy dominance with, basically being a net exporter of energy. And the fact is, actually, as we export more, we're more interdependent from an energy market standpoint. So nomenclature aside, what we're looking for is this. If we compare back to 2008, for example, where we were importing so much, we have cut our imports of oil by 10 million barrels per day relative to 2008 as of this year. So phenomenal progress. And for several years, the U.S. has been a net exporter of natural gas. That's not new. For several years, or many years, the U.S. has been a net exporter of coal. No surprise there. The electricity trade between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada is really small. So it really comes down to the fact that our oil imports traditionally have been so large that has made us a net energy importer up perhaps until very recently here. And what we're going to see is, as we grow our oil production, as our crude oil and refined product exports grow, we have the ability to have enough oil exports finally that it's, or bring our net imports down low enough that it's more than offset by the coal and the natural gas that we already export. And that crossover by EIS, that should happen later this year.
Maybe we want to move to the monthly report now.
Absolutely.
I had 2 questions, or one question that's on 2 different slides here, actually. You have U.S. oil production monthly new well production per rig. You have that for the oil and for the gas sector, and it looks like the Permian and the Bakken are highlighted for oil, and the Appalachia and the Haynesville are highlighted for the gas. Can you walk the listeners through? Obviously, they'll be able to pick this up on Thursday, but what's in this? What does this mean? What does it represent? Is there anything significant we should take from this news? Because I'm curious your thoughts, because what you have on here is not what I would have expected, I should say. So I'm curious what your takeaway was from this was.
Well, the takeaway is that both from an oil and a gas perspective, the Permian Basin has added tremendous pipeline capacity. The gas chart is highlighted actually in here, but from an oil perspective, you're looking at 1.5 million barrels per day of new oil capacity. Then on the gas side, it's like 5 billion cubic feet per day if we're comparing the fourth quarter of this year to the fourth quarter of the previous year. Roughly what this means is that the market should work, whereas we've seen at times this year even negative natural gas prices in West Texas because there hasn't been sufficient infrastructure to have egress for that product. And at the same time, on the oil side, it's bottled up a lot of product that otherwise would be making its way to the coast, potentially exported, potentially refined. And if we go back to May, we had a $10 per barrel difference, $10.50 actually, between Brent crude oil in the North Sea and West Texas Intermediate crude oil inland in Cushing, Oklahoma. So what that means is that as of this last month, that's cut down to $4 and change. So we've more than cut in half that difference just by having this pipeline infrastructure. And that really is a strong story as to the value of having the infrastructure. And that's the point in highlighting within the monthly statistical report.
One of the interesting things that came out last week was a report by IHS saying that they believe that in 2020, natural gas prices will average $2 or below. And some people are saying that they think that estimate is way too low, and that if it actually went that low and maybe was sustained, that this would cause bankruptcies and all sorts of bad things happening in the industry. And I was wondering if you could comment on that. Do you think this is a realistic assessment, or is it really something that's maybe isolated to a particular region?
That's a really interesting question, and it could go either way, and here's the reason. We've had this record production, and if we look at EIA's current estimates in their short-term energy outlook, if we look out to 2020, they have natural gas production growth having gone from these, it's 8% year over year. This year, it was like 12% last year. They have it going to 0 next year in 2020 in response to these lower prices. So a lot of this hinges really two things. Natural gas markets are by their very nature seasonal. So if you get a really cold winter, the market goes short and you get a price spike, and almost regardless of what you produce and what your inventories are, you could see some higher prices as a result of just seasonal weather. Now, that said, the other side of this coin is what happens with LNG exports and whether they continue to go. I don't know what IHS's particular assumptions are there, but the longer-term story that we've tried to highlight in our quarterly is that we really do see the need to expedite and enable these projects fundamentally, because if those projects didn't go, that is by far your largest demand growth source for U.S. natural gas. And if that didn't go, that would back up into the upstream as the Permian Basin continues to grow its production of associated gas at the same time as the Haynesville and Ohio and Pennsylvania up in the Marcellus Utica region are also continuing to go gangbusters in terms of their gas production.
You have a slide on here that says U.S. total energy consumption exceeded 100 quadrillion BTU for the first time in 2018. That sounds like a lot of BTUs. But more importantly, my question is, one of the things Ellen and I have long wondered about when you look at demand forecast long term is it seems that they're always downplaying demand forecast. Now that we're at this spot, where does this kind of put us at globally? How should we look at emerging markets? And is this a threshold that we will kind of measure other markets as they, as they go to first world status or other first world countries, where we look at them and say, okay, when you hit this number, this is a point of significance, or is it just kind of a cool stat? Hey, we're at 100 quadrillion.
Awesome question, and we are actually preparing comments for the House Energy and Commerce Committee that will go in soon on exactly this, where you've got some very real questions and well-intentioned policy in trying to address climate issues. And when we look, as much as we believe technology will play an important role in helping to solve these issues, we also have to look pragmatically about what path is the world on in terms of its long-term energy use. And when we look at the relationship, and there'll be a chart in there that looks at the relationship between the global economy and its growth on one hand, and then how much oil, how much natural gas, and how much coal has been used on the other. And what we see is that, and we've talked about this on this show in the past, that as the global economy has continued to grow, global oil demand has continued to grow at roughly half that rate. So if the world grows 2.6% this year on a market exchange rate basis, that's probably 1.3 million barrels per day of new oil demand, give or take. So that relationship also holds for natural gas, but on a much stronger basis, where natural gas has actually been growing globally at 90% the rate of global GDP growth. And the surprising thing here is that despite a lot of coal switching for natural gas and renewables across Europe and the United States, on a global basis, you have tremendous additions, almost 50 megawatts per year in Asia Pacific of new coal-fired generation. And substantially, this is more than offset and actually increased emissions due to coal-fired generation. So as we start to look at those challenges, we have to look at a holistic global landscape of how we address things in a very constructive way that cuts across all of the sources of emissions, all of the countries emitting, because, frankly, partial solutions aren't going to cut it here.
One of the things that the market is really looking forward to, I guess, is or I don't know, maybe the market's not looking forward to it, but they should be looking forward to the weekly data that will come out about draws in U.S. inventories. And Ryan and I were talking earlier about whether or not we think that the market might be more attuned to these kinds of draws or builds now that we've seen this incident in Saudi Arabia that has cut off 5.7 million barrels per day of output, at least temporarily. I'm wondering what are your thoughts on this? Do you think that people will be paying closer attention to the API and then the EIA data on these weekly data releases will have a greater impact on the market than they might normally have?
That certainly could be the case, and I think you're right that as you get some uncertainty on the international side in terms of crude oil production and exports and where the trade patterns are likely to shift, that increases the importance of really understanding the optics on the most transparent market. And the benefit of our monthly report is that it covers all the inside baseball details on U.S. oil markets, really 2 months with monthly data ahead of EIA. So the weekly bulletin that we put out, the weekly statistical bulletin for API, gives these inventory drawdowns in very clear focus, and Wall Street usually consumes those data. Here in the monthly statistical report, we've really digested into something that people can understand and try to understand where it's likely to go on that basis. And you're right, the crude oil stocks, but also the refined product stocks, and what's happening as refineries have ramped up the utilization, they've drawn down the crude, but now we have an increased inventory sitting of product. So it's not an all bad news story to see crude oil stocks drawn down, but now the question is, where's the market likely to head in terms of the flow of both the crude and the products?
That also goes into something that I was discussing with some people earlier today, which is that with Saudi Arabia really diverting a lot of its, the crude production that it has and its storage into satisfying customer orders, it's cutting back on the feedstock that it's sending to Saudi petrochemical companies, and that they're likely to experience a real decrease in refined product and petrochemical production. And perhaps there is an outlet for American products here.
You're right. We could see U.S. oil heading to Saudi Arabia.
or U.S. products, perhaps. I would say we could see perhaps products or petrochemicals, or at least heading to Saudi Arabia's customers.
It can, and the whole value chain in Saudi Arabia and with SABIC has depended upon joint ventures and other refineries to bring product in that aren't necessarily created all in countries. So depending on where the supply is, we certainly could see more U.S. product at least finding its way fungibly globally into a chain which ends up ultimately benefiting everyone globally and trying to make those pieces fit.
Okay, I don't have anything else. Ellen, do you have anything else for Dr.? I mean, I shouldn't say I don't have anything else. There's a lot of stuff, but I know we're up against the clock. So any other quick one-hitter questions for Dr. Foreman, Ellen?
I think that about covers it.
Sounds good. I was prepared if you wanted to discuss the Saudi situation a bit more, but it sounds like you're on it.
We can do that. I didn't know how much you knew about it. Do you have any insights into the into the speed of repairs or what's going on there? Because let's suffice to say we're hearing conflicting reports.
I think that's correct, and at this point we see what the market sees, so we're following it. The most important thing is just to make sure that we've got as much transparency and that the U.S. is in a position to deliver if needed. So right now, that's where we're trying to add some transparency.
I actually did have one thing that I wanted to ask that I forgot. In terms of SPR releases, that's definitely been a thing that's been on everyone's mind, particularly since the president announced that he has authorized the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to a range for releases if it's necessary. And one of the things that I recall is that there is a SPR release already scheduled, I believe, for October. So do you see this as really just a symbolic kind of message to the markets, or is there a potential really to actually release crude from the SPR? And if so, could that crude actually be exported as opposed to used by American refineries? I'm not really up to date on the regulations with the SPR.
Well, I believe the October release is based on a sale that's already been announced. So that's pretty much a done deal. And then everything that goes forward here, absolutely, they could release more. And then how that goes and flows, since it's fungible at the end, it doesn't really matter whether it gets placed domestically or flows internationally. Pretty sure it just gets sold to whoever has signed up to purchase it at that point. Now, the interesting thing is that since the outage this weekend, we've seen not only the announcement of prospective or potential but uncertain in terms of quantity SPR release, we've seen Saudi Arabia say that it will up its production from offshore facilities. We've seen Russia say it's reassured its view on inventories and the ability to ramp up some production. So that you have multiple efforts to try to reassure the market, yet we saw prices go up 20% to start the day, back down to about 10% up, or $6 to $7 per barrel. And the market's just going to grapple with these conflicting reports, as you said, and we'll have to see how bad the damage is and how long it's likely to endure. Having been there, having lived there, the one thing I would say is that you've got some of the largest midstream facilities in the world that go through Abqaiq. So with that backdrop, if the damage is substantial, it's not an easy fix. So we'll have to see exactly what happens and how that sorts itself out. In the meantime, so I think these reassurances to the market are important, and it's a good thing that that's happening. But it also shows the U.S. Cushion that's being provided by having domestic production in a different light, where the U.S. market should be relatively more insulated as a result of having this production. And for the second year in a row, the U.S. continues to supply virtually all of global oil demand growth. So it really is a great story. And as we're sensitive to climate issues, especially this month with all the releases that are happening, to have a really great story in terms of reliance on the U.S. as this critical backbone of U.S. and global supply, it really is a good object lesson and why there's the value of having domestic production and infrastructure.
This was really, really fascinating. And we really appreciate you taking us through this report, because there was so much in there. And I really encourage all of our listeners to go to API's website and to access the full report when it is available.
And I will say this, I enjoy the monthly reports, but I really like the quarterly ones because they kind of give you a different take on things. You get some different tidbits in there. And so thank you for that, Dr. Foreman. I've enjoyed it, and I don't know what all modifications you will be making. As you said, just a few small ones, but nothing that we've talked about today will change. So listeners, go sign up for that. I think they can get it by signing up for the email list on the website. API.org is where they can find it. Dr. Foreman, anything else before we get you out of here today?
No, that's awesome. Ryan, Ellen, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Foreman. And once again, I want to thank Dr. Foreman for coming on this show. The quarterly stuff is quite fascinating, so I enjoy that. Lot to dig in there. Monthly wasn't bad. The quarterly is just like, compared to the quarterly, the monthly, the quarterly is like a big old steak, and the monthly is like a potato. So, if you like steak and potatoes, country like myself. Ellen, before I ask you where you will be, I have to ask you this question. Will you be reading and or listening? I don't think you do audio books, but will you be reading the new book that is coming out tomorrow by the one, the only Edward Snowden? His biography.
Oh my God. Oh, I really want to. You know what? I bet I could pick up a copy at the airport and read it on my way home.
Yeah,
my flight will be delayed, so I'll be able to really get into it. Ooh, I'm so all over that.
Yeah, that comes out tomorrow, wherever good books are sold, I suppose, or communist books or bad books or whatever you think of him.
Wait, who's publishing this? Is it being published in Russia? A Russian publisher?
This is published by Metropolitan Books.
Oh my God! Really?
Yeah.
No kidding. That's very interesting. Okay. So
Metropolitan Books. Apparently, I've seen one excerpt that he's ready to come home. So I don't know. Curious to see what he says. Anyways. So where will you be besides on a plane reading Edward Snowden's books?
Let's see. Well, tomorrow, if anyone gets this in time, which you may not, but you can always tune into repeats. I will be on Bloomberg Daybreak America tomorrow, which is Tuesday at 8:30 a.m., which is really, really, really early. But we're going to give a full update analysis of the situation in Saudi before markets open, and then I will also be have an op-ed coming out on Bloomberg that kind of looks at what's going on with the Aramco IPO and recent developments. And I am quoted along with the estimable Samir Madani in a CNBC article addressing similar things as well. So I want to plug him. And then you can also find me on investing.com on Thursday.
And if it goes well, she'll be on Drudge Report. So keep hitting refresh on Drudge to see if Ellen appears there. I'll be on the Text
Someday I will make it.
Text Oil and Gas Podcast, Oil and Gas Contractors Connect, Bring in the Closers. Of course, this show, Ellen, paperback edition of your book came out last week, correct?
Yes, correct. It did. So buy it on Amazon.
When this launched, we had to deal with the listeners. You buy 4, you get 4. So hardback, Kindle, audio, now paperback. So you buy 4, you get 4. That's how it works. It's pretty cool. You buy one of each and you have one of each. And you never know. We went through the disaster scenarios of what could happen, and now you might need a paperback for various reasons if you have the hardback. But
that is true. You may very well.
If you want Ellen to write more books, you have to buy her books. That's just how it works.
That's how it works, basically. That is exactly how it works.
Well, I'm sure next week we will have plenty of information to source through as we have information, disinformation, and re-information over the next few days. All things Saudi Arabia. Maybe all hell won't break loose. But until then, we will talk to you next week.